On the 6th of October, 1973, the 10th day of Ramadan, the Muslim holy month, and Yom Kippur, the holiest of holy days in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched an all-out war against Israel. This first liberation of land occupied by Israel in the 1967 Six-Day War provoked an enthusiastic response across the Arab world.
فعلا الشعب المغربي تحمس كثيرا.
The Moroccan people were so enthusiastic about the war. That was evident in the campaign organized in Moroccan cities, especially the big ones, to donate blood. And it was a very popular campaign.
كانت حملة قوية جدا.
الرئيس الراحل هواري بومدين تبنى.
Algerian President Boumediene took up the cause and gave a blank check to the Soviets and said, spend it as you like on weapons, $100 million for Egypt and $100 million for Syria, to cover everything they need in the way of ammunition, weapons, spare parts, and so on.
In October 1973, the Arab world seemed to have united behind a single precious goal. But the common purpose of Egypt and Syria, the two countries who started this war, was about to dissolve into acrimony and mistrust. The Syrian Golan Heights, occupied by Israel in the 1967 Six-Day War, still occupied to this day. This high plateau is a tranquil and beautiful place. But it is also scarred and defaced by the bloody fighting that took place here in October 1973. Memorials stand to the Israeli forces who fought a desperate battle to stop the Syrian thrust, which threatened to reach right to the heart of Israel. In the first 5 days of war here on the Golan, Israeli losses alone amounted to 250 tanks and hundreds of men.
It was ambitious for the Syrians to think that they could penetrate significantly into the Israeli rear over the course of 24 hours. But it was not wholly unrealistic. Had the Israelis not been able to respond flexibly, it is entirely possible that a Syrian exploitation force could have penetrated into northern Israel within a day.
But it was not to be. In less than 24 hours, Israel had mobilized 2 armored divisions, which soon turned the Syrian advance into retreat. On the 10th of October, and after suffering huge losses in tanks, the Syrians withdrew from the Golan Heights. Back behind the 1967 ceasefire line, the same place they had started their assault 5 days earlier. Now the Israelis faced a crucial choice. What should be their next move? The decision taken in Tel Aviv was typically bold: to go on the attack, to push on into Syria itself.
We're going to make it clear to the other side that the game of breaking the ceasefire is a two-sided one. And we are going to press, and we are going to push, and we are going to bomb, and we are going to punish as much and as long as we can until the other side does understand the rules of the game.
The effort to take Syria out of the war had already started the previous day, with strikes by the powerful Israeli Air Force.
In the worst possible conditions, we penetrated deep into Syria to Damascus and blew up their Air Force headquarters and their general staff. both of them.
These were the first of a string of attacks targeting Syrian infrastructure.
And at that stage, the Syrian population would go up on the roof to watch the bombs fall and were still rather excited. The horrible truth hadn't yet sunk in that their country was in mortal danger.
Alongside the heavy aerial strikes, Israel would launch its ground offensive. 2 armored divisions would attack across the 1967 ceasefire line, known as the Purple Line, along the Damascus Road, towards the Syrian capital, 60 kilometers to the east. At first light on 11th of October, the assault began. Despite fierce Syrian resistance, the Israelis advanced, capturing territories deep inside the Syrian mainland.
The retreat began when the Israelis launched a massive counterattack. The 1st Division started to retreat before the Israeli army. When it did, it had almost 250 tanks, and the infantry brigades behind it. They started to retreat too. This resulted in the advance of the Israeli army. I remember that day. The president issued an order dismissing the commander of that division and appointing another in his place.
Stories emerged that Assad's punishment for his commanders went beyond mere dismissal.
I remember, yes, more than one officer was arrested, and it said that some of them were executed. There was one senior commander that President Assad summoned and asked him to account for himself. The commander then shot himself in front of the president.
Assad's rage was born of the anger he felt towards his allies in Cairo. The Egyptians had successfully stormed across the canal on the first day of war. They had quickly established a defensive bridgehead 10 kilometers deep and repulsed all the Israeli armored attacks. But since then, they had moved not an inch further, east into Sinai.
President Assad kept calling President Sadat, telling him, "Mr. President, advance. The whole Israeli armed forces are in front of us, and we are taking aerial strikes by the entire Israeli Air Force. There is nothing stopping you from advancing deep into Sinai, as we agreed." But there was no answer.
8 months earlier, at a meeting in Egypt, Sadat and Assad had forged a plan with a common purpose. They had agreed to launch a war against Israel on 2 fronts. But now it seemed the 2 presidents had entirely different concepts of the war they had planned together.
Assad told me that from the moment of his seizure of power, his ambition, his dream, was to avenge the defeat of 1967, when Syria had lost the Golan to Israel and when Assad himself had been defense minister. So I think he felt this sort of personal responsibility for the recovery of the land. Assad saw the war, which he was planning, as a war of liberation.
Sadat, on the other hand, had been planning for a limited war to focus the minds of the world's superpowers and jumpstart the stalled peace process.
When President Sadat came to power, he met with us in March 1971. He told us, "I just need to get things back on track. Just give me 10 centimeters of land in the east, and that will be enough."
A week into the war, Sadat's personal target had already been surpassed. It seemed a swift victory might be in sight. In the early hours of October the 13th, he was woken for an urgent meeting. the British ambassador had come with an offer to broker a United Nations ceasefire resolution. The Israelis, he told Sadat, were ready to accept the ceasefire based on the current positions.
The Israeli army had been hit hard. The Israeli army was ready to accept a ceasefire. It was a defeat at that moment, a terrible defeat, and we were ready to accept that, which shows that we'd given up hope of winning the war.
Seduced by success, Sadat now refused the British offer. He would only accept a ceasefire, he said, if Israel withdrew from the whole of Sinai.
Things were going very well for Sadat. He didn't want to stop the war. Something dramatic had to be done to persuade him to agree to a ceasefire, maybe even to get him to request the ceasefire. And the only thing that could work was crossing of the canal. That might scare him enough.
But the Egyptians, alive to the possibility, had held 2 armored divisions with over 200 tanks each and a second line of defense west of the canal. It was a problem of which Israeli Chief of Staff, General David Eliezer, was well aware.
Before crossing the canal, he wanted to draw those 2 armored divisions to the Israeli side for 2 reasons. One, not to have to cross while those 2 divisions are waiting for him on the bank of the canal when you're very vulnerable. Number 2, to have them on the Israeli side where he can meet them on Israel's terms.
General Eliezer was sure that a second phase of the Egyptian attack would begin on October the 9th, with those 2 armored divisions crossing the canal to advance on Sinai's strategic passes some 40 kilometers to the east. But the Egyptian plan was to stay put. Yet 48 hours later, President Sadat gave a new and surprising order to his war minister, General Ismail. They were to go ahead with just this second phase, the advance that Eliezer had been waiting for.
On October 11th, Ahmed Ismail came to me and said, "We want to advance to the passes." I told him it was not possible for many reasons. He came again on the 12th and said, "We want to go ahead with the advance to take the pressure off Syria." I told him, "We can't take the pressure off Syria. The enemy air force is capable of holding any front." Again, on the 12th, for the 3rd time, he said, "No, this is a political decision and it has to be implemented."
After a long debate with Shazli, General Ismail issued orders to the commanders of Egypt's 2nd and 3rd Field Armies to begin the advance east.
Immediately, both of them called me and said, "We can't carry out these orders the minister sent us." That's what I was told by Saad Ma'moun and Abdel Munaim Wasil. And Saad Ma'moun even said he is ready to hand in his resignation.
That night, the 2 commanders were summoned to Center 10, the Egyptian Armed Forces Command Center in Cairo.
Right till midnight, Ahmed Ismail was just like a broken record. This is a political decision, and it has to be implemented. If you don't, it's tantamount to mutiny. So all we could manage to do was to postpone the start of the attack until the 14th. We delayed it for 24 hours.
Ironically, at almost exactly the same time Egyptian commanders were arguing over an attack from west to east, the Israelis were locked in their own debate about an attempted crossing in the other direction. Attending this stormy meeting in Golda Meir's office was Zvi Zamir, the head of the Israeli intelligence, Mossad.
The meeting was held in Tel Aviv with the inner cabinet and the general staff. And in the middle of the discussions, someone entered and whispered into Zamir's ear, and he excused himself and went out.
Zamir returned with astonishing information from an impeccable source, a spy operating at the heart of affairs in Cairo. The Egyptians were on the point of moving their armored divisions across the canal. Next day, 13th of October, confirmation arrived in Israel. An American spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, had photographed the Suez Canal front with high-resolution cameras. Reconnaissance pictures showed the West Bank was suddenly empty of Egyptian tanks. The Egyptians were committing their biggest mistake of the war. The Israelis would do nothing to stop them.
Ibrahim al-Arabi, the commander of the 21st Armored Division, told me. I was surprised because while we were crossing from west to east, I expected to be hit by the Israeli Air Force. But nothing happened. Not a single tank was hit in the crossing from west to east. They just let us in.
The Egyptian plan was to make 4 simultaneous thrusts towards the Sinai strategic passes and crossroads. 3 of the assaults would be made by armored brigades. The central push would be by a full division, the 21st Armored. At 6:30 on the morning of the 14th of October, the Egyptian armor moved east.
The one brigade commander I spoke to said it was like a flood in the Negev, water suddenly pouring down, suddenly out of the eruption of Egyptian tanks.
The Israelis were waiting for the tank assault in pre-prepared positions on the ridges east of the Egyptian bridgeheads.
Then all the tanks came up, and boom, 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 boom.
In the first few minutes of the battle, the Egyptian 21st Armored Division suffered significant casualties.
One of the Armored Brigade commanders was martyred, Colonel Sayyid Tawfiq Abu Shadi. Also, his chief of staff was injured, and the commander of the artillery brigade was martyred. There was a lot of confusion at the front.
We definitely succeeded in stopping dozens, if not hundreds, of Egyptian tanks and blowing them up, with not many casualties on our side during the action.
By midday on the 14th of October, 250 tanks had been lost. The Egyptian General Command ordered all advancing forces to retreat westwards to the bridgeheads.
It was an attempt to relieve the pressure on the Syrian front, but it didn't do that. How could we do that? The distance between us and them is 500 kilometers. How could we relieve the pressure?
In fact, by the time the Egyptians launched their attack, the Syrian front had already been stabilized. The Israelis had been forced to halt their advance by the arrival of Iraqi troops.
They arrived and surprised our forces when they attacked. We had put out an alert that the Iraqi forces are moving towards the Golan, but we couldn't tell them the precise location. So that came as a surprise. They tried to place part of the blame on us, but what could be done?
The Iraqi 3rd Armored Division had moved swiftly from its bases around Baghdad towards the Golan, a distance of over 1,000 kilometers.
We arrived that night at the outskirts of Damascus. It was guarded by Syrian civilians. The things they said to us that night, the 11th of October, shocked us. Are you Iraqis? Yes, we are Iraqis. For God's sake, save our honor. We thought it was a total victory. That was a huge shock. We started to realize that the situation had completely changed.
Despite their fatigue, the Iraqi forces were rushed to the front to reinforce Syrian troops retreating before the advancing Israelis.
We had penetrated deep into Syrian territory. I climbed a couple of observation towers. I saw the air was full of dust, and I assumed it was one of our forces on the move. The division commander called me in and told me that a very large force was moving towards us, and that it was very close, something like 1,000 meters away.
In that situation, that was a strategic victory on the Syrian front. The timing was perfect. If it had come just 24 hours later, it would have been much tougher, and the Israeli forces would have reached the gates of Damascus.
5 squadrons of the Iraqi Air Force, some 60 aircraft, were flown to Syria to make up for losses sustained by the Syrian Air Force.
The Iraqi presence refreshed the Syrian pilots' appetite for the battle. Even the most hesitant now said, how come pilots from Iraq are up for the fight while the Syrians are reluctant to leave base? So it turned into a competition to carry out their missions.
With the arrival and the participation of Iraqi forces in the war, the Jordanian army was now straining at the leash.
It was very embarrassing for us. I mean, it embarrassed the late King Hussein a lot, because there were 2 Arab countries who had territory occupied in 1967, and Jordan was the 3rd Arab country whose territory had been occupied in 1967. But those 2 other countries are fighting to regain what they lost, while you're not. I remember I attended one of the meetings he held with the military, and I saw how much pressure they put on him to go to war.
In the face of the present developments, the Jordanian forces entered Syria and have been heavily engaged in action throughout yesterday.
But the Iraqis and Jordanians were not the first to arrive. 5 months before the outbreak of the war, King Hassan II of Morocco had sent a brigade to support the Syrian front. The Moroccan brigade was given the name Tajrida.
The expression Tajrida means help or campaign. The Moroccans were given the task of guarding the eastern foothills of Mount Hermon.
More expeditionary forces would soon arrive from other Arab countries.
On the Syrian front, we first faced a Moroccan brigade. Later, the Iraqis came, and we fought them too. Then later the Jordanians came, and after that the Saudis. So we found 4 armies there we had to fight.
The Israelis had suffered heavy losses, but they had also achieved significant gains in the last 4 days. They had advanced to within 35 kilometers of Damascus and occupied new territories to bring to the bargaining table after the war. Now, their initial goals in the north achieved, the Israelis were about to turn their attention south to the Egyptians. The plan to cross the Suez Canal had been finalized and given the name Stout-Hearted Men.
Against a backdrop of war and violence, the Kinshasa Symphony Orchestra continues to play, an inspiration to its musicians and spectators alike. Ordinary individuals playing extraordinary music. A struggle for expression. A story of hope. Witness Kinshasa Symphony at this time on Al Jazeera.
Hello there, I'm Shireen Tadros, and these are the headlines on Al Jazeera. Human Rights Watch has accused Syrian rebels of killing at least 190 civilians in August during an offensive in Latakia province. In a report, the group says many of the fighters who committed murders are linked to Al-Qaeda.
Residents that I spoke to told me that in the early morning hours of August the 4th, that they heard the sound of incoming gunshots and mortar fire. They described how opposition fighters came into their villages, into their homes, executed individuals, shot at residents while they were trying to flee, and tried in many cases to kidnap women and children to hold them as hostages.
The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The Norwegian Nobel Committee says the OPCW deserves the prize for its continuing efforts to rid the world of chemical weapons. The organization is currently overseeing the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. Asmet Ozomcu heads the OPCW and has been reacting to the award.
The recognition that the Peace Prize brings will spur us to untiring effort, even stronger commitment and greater dedication. I truly hope that this award and the OPCW's ongoing mission, together with the United Nations in Syria, will help broader efforts to achieve peace in that country and the suffering of its people.
African leaders meeting in the Ethiopian capital are no longer discussing a complete withdrawal from the ICC. Instead, they want to renegotiate the terms to put on trial sitting heads of state. Anti-coup protesters have once again taken to the streets in Egypt. Demonstrations calling for ousted President Mohamed Morsi to be reinstated began just after Friday prayers. This was the scene in the country's second largest city, Alexandria, where thousands are marching. A car bomb has exploded outside the Swedish consulate in the Libyan city of Benghazi. There are no reports of injuries, although the building was damaged. So far, no one is claiming responsibility for that blast. Those are your headlines. The news continues after the war in October.
During the war in October 1973, Ariel Sharon was the general in command of the 143rd Reserve Armored Division, one of three facing the Egyptians in the Suez Front. A controversial personality, Sharon had already developed a plan to deal with any Egyptian attack during his 3.5 years as commander of the Southern Front, an assignment that had ended just 3 months earlier.
So then I asked him, what will happen, Ariel? Have you any doubt where this war is going to end? Where, I asked. On the other side of the canal. That's the only place where it can be terminated. This is the first time I hear that we are going to cross the Suez Canal. It was around 7:30. October the 6th, Yom Kippur, in his kitchen in Beersheba.
On the night of October the 9th, the 4th day of the war, Sharon sent his reconnaissance battalion west towards the canal. Surprisingly, no Egyptian forces intercepted them, and they quickly reached the shores of the Bitter Lake, where the waterway is up to 5 kilometers wide. Turning north, the Israelis entered 2 abandoned forts of the Bar-Lev line, Lakakan and Matzmed. The battalion had stumbled on a 40-kilometer-wide, undefended gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. Sharon was electrified and radioed headquarters for permission to implement his strategy.
When Sharon tells them, we have to cross the canal, we have to arrive in their rear, they tell him, we cannot afford to do what you are suggesting because you are the only division which we got intact. You are the only one between the enemy and Tel Aviv.
What's more, on October the 9th, there were still 2 Egyptian armored divisions on the western side of the canal, ready to counter any Israeli crossing. Sharon's plan was placed on hold, until 5 days later, when those 2 divisions suddenly crossed the canal and began their abortive advance deep into Sinai. Now the Israeli plan could be activated. The time had come for stout-hearted men. But to pull it off, the Israelis would need to transport a curious mix of equipment to the waterline.
They picked up in Europe a second-hand pontoon bridge the year before, a war surplus, and they'd also picked up floating rafts, mechanized rafts, which can carry a tank.
But third, and most important, was an actual bridge. Specially built in Israel, this was how the main forces would cross the canal.
The idea of the bridge, this roller bridge they call it, it was a bridge that was built intact. It was 200 meters long, metal bridge with metal rollers, iron rollers, but the rollers were filled with substance that floated. You pull it to the canal, but with tanks. When you reach the edge of the canal, you got tanks in the back just pushing it into the water, and you have a ready-made bridge.
But getting the 400-ton bridge to the water's edge, a 25-kilometer journey, was to prove harder than expected. Before the war, the Israelis had cut a dirt track specially designed for moving the bridge to a pre-prepared crossing point. But now that track was in Egyptian hands. A strong defensive position, the southern flank of the 2nd Egyptian Army, stood in the way of any Israeli advance. The battle to open the road to the canal would be called the Battle of Chinese Farm. Like farms on the eastern bank of the canal today, the area was an Egyptian agricultural development on which work had begun in the early 1960s with the help of Japanese experts. Occupied during the Six-Day War, the Israelis had mistaken the Japanese writing on irrigation equipment for Chinese. The farm had now been recaptured by the Egyptians. The 16th Division dug into dry ditches, now serving as trenches.
They had to engage the Second Army in a tank battle so that the bridges could reach the canal and the tanks could cross on the bridges.
At dusk on the 15th of October, the Israeli tanks started their assault on the Chinese farm. But the Egyptians would counter the attack using their new highly effective weapon, anti-tank guided missiles.
I remember the conversation between our brigade commander, Tuvia Raviv, and division commander, Ariel Sharon, and he called Tuvia Raviv 2, because it was the 2nd of his 3 brigades. And he said, 2, this is 40. 40 is the division commander. The attack is looking good. And Tuvia Raviv, who had a deep Romanian voice, said, 40, 2 here, it's our tanks that are burning. Over.
While Sharon's division was taking heavy casualties in the Chinese farm, a 750-strong Israeli paratroop force was advancing towards the canal across the dunes. By midnight, they had reached the crossing point.
The paratroop brigade reached the canal on half-tracks and carrying with them on the half-tracks rubber boats, and they crossed, uncertain of what they would find on the other side. And the first man to climb on the other bank yelled clear, and they knew there was no one there, and they established a bridgehead. So there was now an Israeli presence on the western bank.
But despite the desperate efforts of the Israelis, the road to the canal remained closed by an entire Egyptian infantry brigade. But there was one ray of light for the Israelis. Their mechanized rafts could move independently across open terrain. And by 6:30 on the morning of the 16th of October, 15 rafts had reached the canal and began ferrying tanks to the west.
Just when we arrived there, and it's quiet around, and we are there, on the canal. Sharon sends between 12 to 20 tanks across the canal. And what happens is exactly what he said. And it's in disarray. The Egyptians don't know what happens to them. For 24 hours. That arrival in the rear of the enemy was exactly what Sharon was aiming at. And the decisive phase of the war is closing now.
The Israeli canal crossing went almost unnoticed by the Egyptians. And later that same morning in Cairo, it seemed the head of state was totally unaware of what was going on at the front. In his first public appearance since the start of the war, Sadat led a victory parade through the streets towards Parliament. He was accompanied by War Minister General Ahmed Ismail. In a rousing speech, Sadat set out his conditions for a ceasefire, a total Israeli withdrawal from Sinai. Later that day, in Jerusalem, Golda Meir made her own speech. She decided to share the good news with the Israeli Knesset.
At 4:15 this afternoon, the Israeli population were told for the first time that their troops were on the west bank of the Suez Canal.
What Mrs. Meir said came as a surprise, not just to the Israeli people, but also to the Egyptian military. Israeli paratroopers and tanks had formed a limited bridgehead on the western side of the canal, in an area called Dever Soir. But Egyptian reports about the Israeli crossing were confusing and underestimated the scale of the problem.
There was a problem with reconnaissance, and most or all of the reconnaissance units were on the eastern side of the canal. There was no reconnaissance in the west to provide information, and that's why, when I asked for information about the west, no one knew anything much.
It was only when the Israeli forces in the west went on the offensive that the Egyptians first grasped the extent of their problem, that the enemy was already in their backyard.
One of the tank brigade commanders, the first to cross, received a radio call from headquarters saying someone wants to talk to you. He recognized the voice as that of the Air Force commander, General Benny Peled. And Peled said, do you have a map? I said, yeah. Do you see the flowers on them? Those are SAM batteries. Please destroy them. Out.
Located on the western side of the canal, the Egyptian surface-to-air missiles had caused the Israeli Air Force heavy losses in the first days of the war. Now reachable by Israeli tanks, it was payback time for the Egyptian air defense. But despite the Israeli success in destroying the SAM batteries, other aspects of stout-hearted men were not going so well.
Ariel Sharon received an order not to activate his forces in the west of the canal, because the concern was that if they were unable to establish a real bridge, a pontoon or roller, it would be impossible to establish a logistics route to evacuate casualties, send supplies, send forces, and then they would even consider cancelling the whole operation.
The Israelis still hadn't gained control of the road to the crossing point. Foot soldiers would have to be used to flush out the Egyptian infantry and tank hunters from the ditches of the Chinese farm.
We were walking in the sands, and a beautiful night in the Sinai where everything was totally quiet, and suddenly we were under heavy fire, attacked by really heavy fire, and the superiority of the Egyptians in numbers and tanks, and we were with light arms.
During that long night, the Egyptians inflicted heavy losses on the paratroopers. 41 killed and over 100 wounded. But the action kept Egyptian forces occupied and brought the Israelis the opportunity to tow their pontoons forward to the crossing point. By the night of the 16th of October, having finally realized the scale of the Israeli operation, the Egyptians reacted. The plan was simple. The 25th Armored Brigade would move northwards to meet up with the 21st Division, which would advance southwards. In a pincer move, the two armored units would close the gap and crush the Israeli forces. The plan seemed straightforward, but to General Shezli, it was flawed. He wanted the brigade to cross to the west and make its assault on that side of the canal, which was under Egyptian control. General Ismail ordered that no forces that had already crossed to the east should cross back to the west. This, he said, was a political decision taken by President Sadat himself. Neither Ismail nor Shezli would back down until finally President Sadat was asked to come to the Egyptian main command center, known as Center 10, to arbitrate on this dispute between the top two commanders of his armed forces.
I told him, Mr. President, I disagree with General Ismail. As soon as I said so, he blew up in my face. Blew up in my face. He shouted at me and kept saying, "Don't ever mention withdrawal." Mr. President, this is not a withdrawal. It's maneuvering with forces. No maneuvering with forces and no withdrawal. Not one soldier is to withdraw. I will have you court-martialed if the word withdrawal is ever mentioned again.
Sadat's decision was clear. The next day, 17th of October, at 0700 hours, the 25th Armored Brigade moved northwards to carry out his mission. But Shezli was about to be proved right.
The 25th Brigade came from the area of the Bitter Lakes, and two tank brigades caught in a sort of ambush. Two tank brigades. One brigade on that side, and the other brigade on the other side. The battle was over very quickly.
The Egyptians suffered heavy losses. With 65 tanks destroyed, only 10 were able to retreat southwards.
حجم الخسائر في اللواء 25 مدرع كان مهول. يعني يمكن
The losses for the 25th Brigade were shocking. Maybe 90% of our tanks were lost. And that was so sad, because these were the best tanks in the Egyptian army, the new T-62. What was even more damaging was what happened to the fighting units around us. They regarded the 25th Armored Brigade as their shield, the pride of the Egyptian army. So what happened to the 25th Armored Brigade was a blow to the morale of the soldiers at the front during that battle.
Meanwhile, in the northern sector of the Suez Front, things were no better for the Egyptians. After 2 days of heavy fighting over Chinese farm, the right flank of the Second Army had been decimated. The remnants of the brigade that had blocked the road to the canal had retreated, but only after making the Israelis pay a heavy price.
Yes, painful victory. Very painful, mainly because of the dead and the wounded. In one night of the crossing of the canal, we lost some 400 people. Tanks were fighting. Some of them we saw in broad daylight later, one barrel against another, like two sword combatants in the medieval time. But here they were, the tanks, both of them destroyed. Maybe most of the people in both of them dead. The valley of death next day along the canal was terrible. But we were on the other side of the canal.
General Adan's armored division had successfully crossed the canal using the pontoon bridge. Next day, 18th of October, early morning, Adan's tanks are unleashed on the Egyptian rear. Soon they have destroyed more SAM batteries, clearing the skies for the Israeli Air Force.
The Air Force started to appear. Previously, we hadn't seen it at all. But after the 17th, we started to see the Air Force a lot. No one to stop them. Our defenses, the anti-aircraft missiles, were non-existent, so the Air Force had a free hand.
On the 18th of October, the Israeli High Command decided to capitalize on the successful crossing, building their presence on the western bank of the canal to 3 armored divisions. Sharon's division would move north to surround the Egyptian Second Army and capture the city of Ismailia. Adan's division, and another commanded by General Magin, would move south to encircle the Egyptian Third Army and capture the city of Suez. This would be their final goal. Israel would come to the bargaining table, holding a trump card.
Israel now had 2 bridges working, a pontoon bridge, a roller bridge. They were now ready to bring an army across to the other side of the canal.
For 2 days, and with the bulk of the Egyptian army on the east of the canal, scattered forces in the west fought bravely, trying to hold their ground against 3 Israeli armored divisions. But they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. General Shazli could see that his plan was on the verge of failure.
I was at the front. I went back and said the situation was becoming very dangerous. So on the 20th, I said, tonight I have to bring back any armored brigade I can afford from the east. I had 4 armored brigades in the east with no job. I said I have to bring them back tonight.
That night, once more, General Ismail had to request Sadat to come to the command center. The president was unmovable. He simply reiterated what he had said 4 days earlier.
His decision was to withdraw not a single rifle or tank from east to west. Everyone to stay where he is and fight. That was nonsense. There is not a war in the world that works like that. You have forces under pressure and you do nothing to assist them, while others have nothing to do and you don't want to bring them into the battle.
For a long time, General Shazli ran the special forces, the paratroops. I mean the kind of forces that do high-risk work. And I think he was really professional. But sometimes he would do bold things, and maybe, on certain occasions, it would lead to trouble.
Sadat's position was clear. Any movement of forces from east to west could undermine morale and lead to the collapse of the whole front. His last bargaining chip would be lost.
Actually, I asked a lot of people who were there at the time. They said, if we had seen just one soldier retreating, the whole army would have done the same.
Shortly after midnight, Sadat left Center 10 and returned to his residency. He summoned the Soviet ambassador and told him that Egypt is ready to accept a ceasefire. This time, though, it was the Israelis who had no interest in a ceasefire.
We can say that Israel had a greater interest in the ceasefire not kicking in right at that moment because it still had work to do, still territory it wants to capture.
But in the third week of the war, international attempts to broker a ceasefire in the Middle East would bring the whole world to the verge of a nuclear confrontation.